Imagine you're standing on a rooftop in Paris, coffee in hand, the Eiffel Tower sitting somewhere in the distance, and you're looking out over the city. And something feels perfect. Not just beautiful, perfect. Like the whole city is one single composed image. Like somebody pressed pause on a really well-directed film. It doesn't feel like New York, where a glass skyscraper randomly shoots up between century-old brownstones, like it got lost. It doesn't feel like Tokyo, where a seven-story building sits directly next to a two-story one, and nobody seems to care. Paris feels deliberately arranged, like a painting where every single brushstroke was intentional. And here's the thing, it was. Because if you look carefully at the buildings lining almost every street in Paris, you'll notice something that's almost eerie once you see it. They're all roughly the same height. Not identical, but close enough that the skyline forms one long, smooth, unbroken line. Street after street, block after block, for miles. So why? Is it coincidence? Is it just French taste? Is it some unspoken agreement every Parisian architect secretly follows? No. The answer involves a deadly epidemic, a power-hungry emperor, one ruthless city planner with a demolition crew, and the law that has quietly shaped the most photographed skyline on Earth for over 150 years. Let's get into it. Here's what makes this genuinely strange. Paris has been continuously inhabited for over 2,000 years. It's survived wars, revolutions, occupations, sieges. Millions of people have lived here, built here, torn things down, and started over. And yet, walk down almost any boulevard in the city center today, and the buildings feel like they came from the same hand. They didn't. Those buildings were designed by different architects across different decades for completely different people with completely different needs. And yet they all seem to have agreed on one thing: how tall to be. That's not culture, that's not coincidence, that's law. There were, and still are, actual legal height limits in Paris, strict ones, enforced ones. And to understand why those limits exist, you have to go back to a version of Paris that looked absolutely nothing like the city you see in photographs today. In the early 1800s, Paris was, to put it plainly, a nightmare. The streets were medieval, some barely wide enough for two people to squeeze past each other. Buildings kept growing taller as landlords tried to stack more and more tenants into every inch of space. Some blocks got so dense and so tall that light literally never touched the ground floor. The streets were dark, damp, and filled with filth. Disease didn't spread slowly in a city like that. It ran. In 1832, cholera swept through Paris and killed nearly 20,000 people. Then it came back in 1849 and killed almost 19,000 more. The city wasn't just ugly, it was lethal. And the overcrowding, the darkness, the chaos, the uncontrolled verticality was the reason. Something had to change. And it did, in the most dramatic way possible. In 1851, Napoleon III came to power. Not the Napoleon, his nephew, but he had similarly large ambitions. He wanted Paris to be the envy of the modern world, the most beautiful, most functional, most impressive city on Earth. To make that happen, he handed control of the city to a man named Georges-Eugène Haussmann. Haussmann wasn't an architect. He was an administrator, essentially the most powerful city manager who has ever lived. And when he looked at medieval Paris, he didn't see history worth preserving. He saw a problem worth solving, so he demolished it. Tens of thousands of buildings gone, entire neighborhoods cleared, and in their place, Haussmann built wide, straight tree-lined boulevards, new sewers, new parks, new bridges, a completely new urban skeleton. But here's the part that matters most to our story. Haussmann didn't just redesign the streets. He designed the buildings that would line those streets. Because he understood something that urban researchers would confirm more than a century later. that humans don't experience streets as roads, we experience them as rooms. Think about this for a moment. When you walk through a narrow alley, walls rising high on both sides, you feel it physically. A slight tension, a sense of being enclosed, hemmed in. Now walk across a massive open plaza with nothing around you for 100 meters. That's uncomfortable too. Exposed, a little anxious, like you're being watched from somewhere you can't see. But walk down a street where the buildings on either side are in the right proportion to the width of the road, and something clicks. You feel held, comfortable, like the space was made for a human being, walking at human speed. Haussmann understood this intuitively, so when he set the width of his new boulevards, he also set the height of the buildings that would frame them, not as a design preference, as a legal requirement. The height of your building had to match the scale of the street it sat on. And just like that, for the first time in its history, Paris began to grow in a coordinated way. The specific rules evolved over time. In the early Haussmann years, buildings were capped around 5 to 6 stories. Later regulations shifted the limit to around 17 or 20 meters, depending on the street width. The exact numbers moved, but the principle never did. Your building cannot be wildly out of proportion with the space it defines. That relationship, not just the height itself, but the ratio between street width and building height, is what creates the famous Parisian roofline. It's a system designed to make the simple act of walking feel harmonious. And it works so well that most people who experience it have absolutely no idea it's happening. They just think Paris is beautiful. They don't know why. They take the photo, they post it, they go home and tell everyone the city feels different. They're right, it does. And the reason is hiding in plain sight, carved into city law 150 years ago. The twist you didn't see coming. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the original motivation behind all of this, the wide boulevards, the coordinated heights, the strict proportions, wasn't beauty. It was control. Napoleon III had a very specific political problem. Paris kept revolting. The city had a long history of uprisings, and those revolutions all had one thing in common: narrow streets. Narrow streets were easy to barricade. Drag out some furniture, overturn a cart, stack some cobblestones, and a mob could hold an entire neighborhood. Troops couldn't move. The government couldn't respond. Wide open boulevards? Much harder to block. Much easier to move artillery through. So the very thing that makes Paris feel romantic and walkable and human today was partly engineered as a tool of political suppression. The beauty was a side effect of the strategy. But then something fascinating happened over time. The rules that started as top-down impositions forced onto the city by an emperor and his administrators gradually became something that Parisians genuinely believed in and fiercely defended. In 1973, a 210-meter glass skyscraper was completed right in the middle of Paris, the Tour Montparnasse. And Parisians absolutely hated it. Not mildly disliked, hated. It became a cultural wound, a running joke. The most famous thing people say about it is this: the view from the top of Tour Montparnasse is the best view in Paris because it's the only place in the city where you can't see Tour Montparnasse. The backlash was so fierce that after its completion, Paris effectively banned tall buildings from the city center entirely. The laws were tightened. Skyscrapers were pushed to La Défense, a business district deliberately placed outside the historic core, and the Skyline was locked back into its familiar, protected form. This tells us something important. When rules survive long enough, when they shape a city's identity deeply enough, they stop feeling like restrictions. They start feeling like values. The height limit in Paris today isn't just a building regulation. It's a statement about what kind of city Paris wants to be.
There's one more layer worth understanding. Research in environmental psychology, the study of how physical spaces affect how we feel, consistently shows that people prefer environments with what's called visual coherence. Spaces where things feel like they belong together, where there's order but not sterility, pattern but not rigid repetition. Paris, with its uniform height limits and its consistent Haussmann aesthetic, the cream limestone facades, the iron balconies, the slate mansard rooftops, is one of the most visually coherent cities ever built at urban scale, kilometer after kilometer of it. Your brain doesn't have to work hard to process it. Nothing jars, nothing competes, everything fits. And when your brain isn't working hard, you feel something that's almost impossible to articulate: calm, belonging, pleasure. That's why people call Paris romantic and can never quite explain why. The architecture is doing something to your nervous system before your conscious mind has formed a single thought about it. The next time you're walking down a street, anywhere, try this. Stop. Look up at the buildings. Then look at the width of the road you're standing on. Then look up again. Does the height feel proportional? Does it feel like those buildings were placed there deliberately, like walls that define and protect the space? Or does it feel like a random collection of decisions made by different people at different times, with no conversation between them? Because that feeling, harmony or chaos, comfort or anxiety, isn't accidental. It's always the result of choices: political choices, legal choices, economic choices, made sometimes centuries before you arrived. Every city you've ever walked through is the physical record of someone's vision, or the absence of one. Paris chose to have a vision. It enforced that vision brutally at first. Then it defended it fiercely when challenged. And the result is a city that billions of people have visited, fallen in love with, and struggled to explain. Because the explanation isn't really in what you see, it's in what you feel. The lesson isn't that every city should look like Paris. Tokyo's layered density has its own electric energy. New York's vertical ambition tells its own story about possibility. Different cities make different bets about what human life should feel like. But Paris teaches us something that applies everywhere. Consistency is a design choice, and design choices have consequences that outlast the people who make them by hundreds of years. We tend to think of cities as things that just happen, places that grow organically, building by building, decade by decade, without any guiding logic. And sometimes that's exactly what they are. But Paris is proof that a city can be a statement, a set of values made physical, an argument written in limestone and slate about what it means to live well, together, in a dense urban space, at human scale. The height limit was never really about keeping buildings short. It was about keeping people at the center, making sure that when you walk down a Parisian boulevard, the space is sized for you, not for cars, not for capital, not for the ambitions of someone who will never walk that street. For you, a person, on foot, experiencing the world at the speed it was always meant to be experienced. And maybe that's the real reason Paris feels the way it does. It was designed, deliberately, stubbornly, over 150 years, to make you feel like you belong there, even if you're just visiting.